live. You never quite can tell when it's going to start. I'm Juliet Wade, and this is Dive into World Building, and today we're talking about sex workers because, you know what was funny? Somebody suggested that we talk about sex workers, and I was like, yes, we absolutely should. And then I like hesitated, but like they're in all these stories, and they're like so stereotypical that I can't stand it, right? So you have to talk about them. Because for goodness sake, let's get past that, shall we? Yeah, I mean, I just think overused in the most stereotypical ways, and we can do so much better than that, really. And as usual, the way that sex work is viewed is different depending on what culture you live in. So, you know, yeah, exactly. How many different. Oh, yes. Okay, so I'm going to lead this off by referring you back to our discussion with Laura Ann Gilman. Because Laura Ann Gilman, when she was talking about her Silver on the Road, was very specific about the fact that she wanted to avoid having any sex workers in her story as much as possible because of the overwhelming use of brothels in Westerns. And right, and so so she absolutely wanted to get away from that, and I was like, yes, good plan, right? And I think she said that there was maybe one person like that. Anyway, so but she just wanted to approach it from a really different direction because every Western appears to have the sort of prostitute with a heart of gold stereotype in it, you know. Yeah, so yeah, that's a good place to start. Too many stereotypes. I think the first time that I ever had sex work brought to my attention was when I was 12 years old and I visited Amsterdam. And we had been driving in the car for a very long time, and I had fallen asleep because I was jet lagged. And I woke up, and the first thing I saw was a woman in a shop window wearing a red teddy. I was very surprised. I mean, you know, like coming out of sleep, and I look out the window expecting, you know, I don't know,
was
the
it
Netherlands,
purple
right?
neon bounded back then? Because it was the last time I saw them in Amsterdam.
When?
I'm assuming it's LEDs now. Night, they're lit up by like purple neon, at least in the late 80s, early 90s.
Well, you know, I think it was
I'm
afternoon.
guessing it's LED now.
I think it was afternoon when I was there. But yes, there is that sort of red light thing. I mean, I think it's actually like iconic in the terms of this is how you mark what you're up to here, right?
It's called
even
the red light district.
Yeah.
Big cities have them.
Yeah.
I understand.
Dang it.
I'm talking so fast that I'm not writing my notes, so I'm going to write notes in a second.
While you're writing your note, I'm just going to call out the fact that Firefly, because it's Joss Whedon, actually lampshades the whole Heart of Gold trope by calling its episode about brothels Heart of Gold.
Yeah. Is that called lampshading? Yeah. Or hanging a light on it, like saying, I know.
Put a hat on it? Spotlight? I don't know. I forget. Yeah, but you're right. There's something. There's a word for it.
I call it hanging the light on it. But I don't know that everybody uses the same phrase. Anyway, yes, but that is a good point. I will write it down.
Yeah. I actually want to explore that because I don't know enough about Westerns and about what was actually happening sociologically in that environment, because there's such erasure in Westerns of POC who are actually there and a significant whitewashing, such that I wonder exactly how prevalent brothels were.
Yeah.
And whether eliminating them is a certain sort of respectability polish instead of an empowerment and avoidance of eroticization and sexualization and other sorts of of dehumanization of population.
I read an article on that one time, and there were there were like, okay, most of the brothels, there were lots of brothels. The states weren't states, they were territories, if they were even incorporated in the United States at that time. So it was kind of basically anything goes. And so what you saw was like a sort of almost hierarchy where there was like white brothels and white women making the most amount of money. Off to the side somewhere were black women. And then you did get like Chinese. And I think there was one who was a Chinese woman who actually, like a madam who was, God, oh man, I read this article years ago. It was pretty long though. God, I wish I could remember what it was.
How did she manage to emigrate? Wow.
What do you mean? Well, it was on the East Coast. The Chinese, because it was because of the railroad workers. The Chinese railroad workers came in, so
the Chinese Exclusion Act was very strict about who they allowed in as immigrants to the U.S. and under what terms, and so it was really difficult for Asian women to emigrate, and unless they were allegedly safely monogamously tied to somebody, et cetera, et cetera. And so you know, this is how we end up with picture brides and men going back to Asia to find wives and things like that. So I'm really kind of curious about the history of this Chinese madam. But I want to say, and this is probably the worst thing. Well, not the worst thing, but like, because I think now I might be confusing. Like I said, I read this article a long time ago, so she might have been Chinese or it might have been a black woman, but I think it was like in Deadwood or something. God, I wish I could remember this.
I mean, one of the things you do see with sex workers is that some did accumulate a huge amount of financial power. Like it was sex workers that funded Seattle Underground. Like the rebuilding of Seattle downtown was funded by sex workers, and the most powerful madame of the region was like, all right, we have all of this money. We will give you this sex worker tax to let you do it. We'll pay you, like, each of us will pay you $1 a month, which was huge, or some other amount. Seattle Underground can tell you. You have to legalize sex work and we will build, and it will pay for it. And they were like, okay, so sex work was legal in Seattle for a while until they built everything they wanted, and then they made it dirty again. But so, I mean, you see these examples of, there was an episode of Drunk History about it, where you have women who accumulate power, and because they have so much money, they're like given a pass. So you can imagine all sorts of circumstances in a, you know, if you are engaging with race in your world building, someone sneaking in as a Bob and then being so good at what they do that they're like, well,
sorry, sneaking in as a what?
Sorry, a Bob. That's a Commonwealth term of a woman who dresses as a man to access, you know, so the classic folktale of a woman whose father dies and then she goes off and does stuff.
Right.
Is that B.O.B.?
Yeah, B.O.B.
Okay.
Most famous from Blackadder, where there is where there is a woman who is clearly a gorgeous woman saying, "I'm a man, and my name is Bob. I'm off to seek adventure." So that's, yeah. So I think that's a really nice term for like someone who is a woman dressing as a man, but their core identity is still female. They're just doing it to access male privilege.
That sounds like a whole nother cool episode.
So I love Bobs. And yeah, so someone could sneak in pretending to be a dude and then accumulate enough power to be like, I'm gonna be out about being a woman now, and do you really want to lose your cash flow?
Yeah, right. Well, there's definitely a power element there, which is really important and should not be overlooked. You know, I think I'm trying to recall exactly the words in which this was phrased, but I have, in the articles that I have read written by sex workers, they emphasize that choosing to have sex, you know, when you want to and make money by doing it because it's, you know, a skill or work thing that you do, means having power over your own sexuality in a way.
Right.
And I think this is far more possible in places where sex work is legal because you have legal protections for people, right? Making it illegal means that if people, if sex workers are mistreated, then they can't really go to the police because what they're doing is fundamentally illegal in the first place. So it just basically excludes them from getting any help when things go wrong.
Yeah, and what research has been shown, I think you can still go to the Scarlet Alliance's website to read it. The Scarlet Alliance is the Workers Association for Sex Workers in Australia, an advocacy body, respected enough that, you know, the NPR equivalent would call them up for interviews to get the sex work opinion kind of thing, and have advocated for specific sex worker skilled migrant visas, because if there's a sex worker shortage, people shouldn't be coming over on the other visas and being exploited. They should be able to come over on their own terms and control their own destinies.
Oh yeah, okay.
But some of their research has clearly shown that where sex work is illegal, what happens is the police, to one degree or another, become the pimps. They are enforcers. They are like the Uber pimps, and they have found that where sex work is legal, police corruption overall reduces, not just in the realm of sex work policing, but in all the other areas, because you don't have this gray area of corruption that where police are often.
So you were saying police become pimps in where it's illegal?
Yes, because they are the ones that choose like what to turn a blind eye to, who to go home. You know, sex workers can be very vulnerable to police officers, you know.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's just that I didn't hear the front part of the word, so I was just checking.
Yeah. So yeah, I highly recommend the Scarlet Alliance as a resource to go to, and they link to research from around the world.
I've got it. I've got it written down. It's going to appear in the report.
Wonderful.
Well, I knew I had you over today for a reason.
I'm writing down about corruption going down, just so you know what I'm up to over here.
Yeah. So as far as world building goes, I think that this goes back also to talking about how in genre spaces we discuss economies.
Yes, it does.
How we discuss empowerment and how we discuss liberation and how we talk about gender roles. And so it really is really central to a whole lot of things, and the idealization just jumps over all of those things, and because we don't always handle economy very well in genre and world building either.
Right.
So also I think the other thing I want to touch on is again, heart of gold is one thing, but there's also the sort of desire to have the magical sex worker.
Okay. Yeah.
In the same way as all the other magical.
And they always have to have a traumatic origin story, just like I once went to a parlor. A friend of mine was going to give me a ride home, and she was a non-sexual prostitute, so she didn't have sex, but she was a bondage mistress, and absolutely, like, that would be a breach of the power dynamic. So yeah, she identified as a non-sexual prostitute and a sex worker advocate. And she was about to give me a ride home, and then she got called in for work, and she was like, "Oh, well, do you want to come to work, and then I'll give you a ride home? I'll like dress you up as a bondage mistress, and you can just stand in the corner and look disapproving, and he'll love it." So like we meet with like I got dressed up in her scariest fair, because I was a writer, and I was like, "Will you say yes to something like that?" It's experience.
Oh my God.
And then while she was there, a walk-in came, and like, that's not an established relationship. So I just hung out in the parlor, and I'd been given a tour, which is cool as well. They wanted me to have a look, and so knew I was an author. So they're like, check out, this is how we actually function.
Cool.
This is how work cover inspects us to make sure we're meeting our occupational health and safety requirements, and where the condoms are stored and audited. And the woman, yeah, got to make sure they're being used. And they're all up to date and up to code. And yes, work cover does an inspection. But when I was sitting before, there was a woman who went by the name of April or Fall or something like that. And so that was the name she used for work. And her reason, she was like, it was very important for me to hear what her reason was. And her reason was she sold her fantastic car to move overseas with her boyfriend. And then her boyfriend sucked. Or no, fiance, they broke up. She came back. She sold her fucking car to be with this dude. She's really pissed off. And she wanted to earn a bunch of money. And she didn't mind having sex. Her car anymore. You know, and she took some pride in some of the tricks of her trade on how to get a dude to get, you know, get off fast, and ways of working on drunk guys who are terrible at getting off. And yeah, it was very much like
it's a craft. I see. Yes.
But she wasn't like, oh, it is a craft. She was like, and then you fake it like this, and you make some really loud sounds, and you got to pretend you're having as fantastic a time as possible. And you're always in top. You just grunt away, and you can make, you know, if you moan loud enough, you can get a dude to come.
This is not Cosmo Sex Tips.
No, and it wasn't. I have a trauma I need to get over. It was. I want to make bank, and I want to buy my car back.
I bet
my car back.
Students whose stipends weren't good enough. And this is not in Australia. This is like places like San Francisco, which have a healthy community of like women doing lap dances and other things. And I would meet people who are like real estate agents, like working until licensure, but they weren't getting enough to support whatever. And yeah, you meet single mothers doing this just because it is lucrative. It's after hours. It leaves them free during the child's waking hours, kinds of things. And
yeah.
So the whole out on the street or a junkie or all these other classic stories are so narrow and limited compared to what's actually out there. And I met some women who are actually, no, I like having sex, and I figured I might as well get paid for it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic to talk from that end. It's also interesting to talk to men who frequent sex workers and sort of the way that some of them have attitude shifts when their primary sexual release is from these economically bounded transactions, and how that changes their attitudes compared to men who are gaining sexual contact with women from other means. And there's an interesting spectrum between some of them who feel that what they're doing is much more honorable because at least they're not doing the MRA pickup artist kind of thing.
Okay.
Versus the sort of I've met women who've dated men who were used to be like that, and then have complained about how transactional they want things to be, or the ways in which the cash for labor entitlement gets skewed when you're actually taking the cash out of the equation explicitly.
Yeah.
So, and then there's also all the explorations about how much is that different from what is socially sanctioned and not considered sex work.
Yeah.
I'm going to let someone else talk now.
I'm still writing notes over here.
I think, like, interestingly, like getting back to genre fiction is it very often, I think probably more so in fantasy than you see in sci-fi, you will have like the only female character is a prostitute. And that's sort of a problem. I've actually read R. Scott Bakker. It's like I I read like I thought it was gonna end. It was like 3 books, and it does not end. There's like 3 more.
Oh, gosh.
They'll have to like hunt down for the library at some point. But his Prince of Nothing series is basically like there are literally like 2 or 3 female characters. One of them is sexually abused. One of them, like the best female character in the whole thing, is actually the prostitute. She's really cool. And then there's just like the evil empress kind of off to the side, who doesn't have that much to do with anything, but is like this horrible human being. But those are like the only women in like the entire book. And it's funny because I almost feel like that's sort of like this weird throwback to fantasy more how it used to be, as like it's not as much anymore, but I feel like that always gets like the it's sort of almost a trope where like your only female characters are prostitutes.
Well, it sounds like these characters are defined by the way they do or do not have sex with men.
No, luckily, it's kind of better than that.
I'm glad. I would hope.
You can go to a comics convention, some of the big ones right now, and you have a choice as a woman to either dress in a way where you are seen as a person, and you might be belittled in some ways, but you actually get seen and noticed because you've dressed smart, you've dressed boldly or attractively. I go for suits so I can like dress boldly. And then there are like, and if you don't choose to like absolutely up your game, you're invisible. Like, and you can see conversations with dudes where they're like, oh, there are no women here. And like, I'm physically in the same place and I can see 6 women, but they haven't dressed up for it, but they haven't dressed up for it. Or that, you know, they're too old or they're too like, whatever. It's like, like often sex workers can be like overrepresented in a fantasy kind of way because everybody, oh, there were no women in the West except the one that one was running a general store, and that one that was a washerwoman, and that one like there's a whole, oh well, I need to find an excuse to wedge a woman in there because I want to be progressive worker because there were no women in the West.
Yeah,
except
all
for
of
all
those cowboys
brothels.
and ranchers and everybody sprang fully formed an adult from. No, wait, that was Aphrodite, and it was a seashell, and
yeah.
They weren't formed because Zeus chased them into a wait. No, that's different too.
yeah. Oh, but you know what? Though, because
But you're right about invisible, and when you have a whole class of people that are invisible, then when you try to introduce them and you don't know anything because they've been invisible for your whole life, you tend to create things that are not very realistic, right? Because you're making it up as though
it's the brothel.
Well, as though you know,
put
as
a
though
brothel
they
in
did
it.
this before, and all of a sudden you thought of putting them in there, and gee, now you have to come up with an idea for how to put them in there, and it ends up being, you know, gross and forced and whatever. But I mean, so right. But okay, so I wanted to actually say that we haven't yet talked about non-female sex workers.
Yes, thank you. God.
And I'm going to also add trans sex workers because trans people are victimized a lot, and many end up in sex work, and it's extremely fraught and dangerous. And I mean, so there's this whole other side of things that I, you know, like I am not like Liz. I have not walked into this, but I know these things are out there, and I think it's worth mentioning that sex work is not exclusively done by women or by cis women.
I think that's really important to say, and I also want to like put in the giant blinking sign of please go talk to somebody who is going to be able to guide you in doing this well, because oh my goodness, the possibility of fail is so high.
So high.
So,
yep.
And I had not yet said this in any of the other broadcasts that we've done, even though some of the other things were also high risk, because this one is life and death for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, not that other things aren't, but this is particularly currently perilous.
Yes.
So.
Definitely.
but yes, talking about the circumstances under which people do or don't choose to do sex work, and the ways in which they are or are not victimized because of doing sex work. I am not really clear on the status and safety of sex work for trans and non-binary people in Australia, for instance, or even in Amsterdam.
Right.
And I think, and like it is legal in parts of Australia, though not uniformly so. And it's generally, and there's always legal and illegal sex work going on at the same time.
Right.
For example, in Canberra, my hometown, it is legal in Fishwick is where you go for sex work, pornography, and fireworks.
Okay.
Oh my god, that is like everything. Like that is like just like hit all the man buttons at once.
On the lesser traveled highways of the U.S., it doesn't actually feature sex work, but the exotic. It usually says exotic dancers, fireworks, and ammo.
Yes.
Trifecta. And occasionally in that same thing, written in giant letters, would be things like we should plug that in. It would say things like corn or peaches or whatever the name produce was for the area.
Yeah.
And so it's very clear that this is all about commoditization.
Mm-hmm.
And Fishwick is also a good place to go for a used car. The government auctions are there. I mean, it's the way they put it in the warehouse district, and it's. I knew someone who worked at a very fancy furniture store in Fishwick, and every now and then people would open the door. Men would open the door and go, and desperately try to
I'd
look
be
interested
very
in
disappointed.
So regulation means that, I mean, if you're in a regulated parlor, you're going to be exposed to more the vulnerabilities of a standard workplace. Plus the fact that, like, if you're a sex worker, you're a contract worker, you shouldn't be expected to do the laundry as well.
Yeah.
And that's something that the sex, here's another resource. So the Sex Workers Alliance, I've forgotten the name. They're covered by the Miscellaneous Workers Union in Australia as their union. And they were actually fighting to be taxed, was one of the things sex workers were, maybe not all, but there was a bunch of them that wanted to be taxed, because when you while it's legal, if it's non-taxable income, you can't get a mortgage.
Oh.
You are held out of capital in certain ways if it is that. So you are safer if you're in a parlor. It's very, people have to have a shower before you have sex with them. The dude has to lie on his back, and the provider, I should say dude, the customer has to lie on the back. The provider is on top, so they are able to disengage at any point at this parlor that I went to. So it was very, a lot of effort around cleanliness, protocols, and even positioning was defined, whereas street work is much more vulnerable to a lot of things, and that's generally the stuff that is illegal. And people will argue, there aren't enough parlors, there aren't enough, there's zoning and stuff like that, and it's forcing more people into dangerous situations. But yes, and another place of being in a place of danger is if you come from a wealthier family, and then you get a very high an occupation that can be very high income, addictively so high income. If you have a background of relative wealth or a support community that has relative wealth, it's going to be easier for you to step away from the how much you can earn, because that can take away certain choices from, you can feel more obliged to make certain choices and feel stuck. Whereas if you were coming from a lower income place, you can stay, it is a challenging physical profession. It is a vulnerable profession that doesn't provide health insurance. It doesn't provide retirement. So it's a lot of respect for people doing such a physical job. But that is, I think that's one of the real risks of it, is that the full healthcare that one would want to appropriately do that.
Yeah.
And the appropriate avenues of able to choose to do a different job. Some
Yeah.
people can step into sex work and it can be a fun lark and a vacation, and for other people it is a lifeline.
Yeah.
And they're going to feel less able to say no to clients that are unhealthy, that they don't want to have.
Right.
Yeah. The more secure you are, the easier it is to say no to a job that is not what you want. I mean, that's just a general principle.
You know,
So-
I was just thinking, because there is like the quest for the sex robot, and what happens if it's all replaced by automation? In some ways, I think.
But I think
you
so
see
much
that,
of
like-
sex work is about human intimacy, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
let's-
Yeah.
I think we should talk about a couple of those things.
Well,
I wanted to actually also hang a note, Juliet. I'd like to eventually get around back to talking about other forms of sex work other than straight up sex for money. So one of the things that everybody I know who engages in a lot of sex work talks about is the fact that often the thing that they are being paid for most strongly is not so much the actual coital actions or genital actions, so much as being there, being present, offering touch, offering an ear, offering a sympathetic place. People
Yeah.
who wouldn't go and work with counselors are
Oh, boy.
seeking out emotional labor.
Right.
And it becomes kind of fraught because often people who are engaging in sex work have no training in safe boundaries and in useful guidance for how to engage in that sort of emotional labor. And doing emotional labor work, counseling work, is known as a kind of occupation in most countries that you are expected to have years of training in, mentorship,
Yeah.
guidance,
No, that's a really good
outlet,
point.
safety, and
Regular debriefing around.
and sex work often involves none of that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet doing the emotional labor.
Yeah, and some parlors might be super supportive, and some might not be, or change over time, and be supportive at some times, and then
Yeah. Well, I mean, the culture of organizations is definitely a factor, right? And so you can have some workplaces that are very supportive and know what each worker is dealing with and are willing to, support them and help them on that. And then
and
you have
mental
other
health is
places
not
that
the
don't.
driving factor behind it, so it's
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point. I do agree, to go back to Che's point about sex robots, because Che said a couple things about sex robots in the chat bar, and I want to make sure they get onto the video. That I don't personally, I totally get what Kat is saying about human intimacy, and I don't think that we're going to, ever move exclusively to sex robots, just because that's got to be your thing or whatever. But at the same time, sex robots are a thing, and boy, are they ever a thing in fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, I was actually watching Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and going, oh, the yellow robots. Oh my God.
Oh no, they had sex robots.
Yeah.
Nobody warned me about yellow sex robots in Guardians of the Galaxy. Is this something I should know?
No, it's just, there's
interesting, though,
just this one scene where, you catch up with this one character who's not, I mean, it's like your introduction to this character, and everybody wants you to know that he's not a great guy. So they stick him in this, this brothel that has only yellow female sex robots.
Yeah, well, part of it is, I think if you could get like sentient, full-on AI,
yeah,
that would happily do this and possibly have the
programming
for like psych, for like a psych degree, It could be like, and the question is like how indistinguishable from human are you looking for? And I think people are looking for as indistinguishable as possible. And then the other point that I just always want to call bullshit on is that it's only ever female sex bots. Like ever. And I'm like, I call bullshit because I think women would want them and gay dudes would want them. I mean, people would want, you know, I'm sorry, you know.
So wait, I want to push back on that. Because some of the other places in very popular genre work that we have sex workers is, first of all, we have Star Trek's Risa, which is very, very gender balanced in what it's offering. And very, and in fact, I think it's one of the places where we do see, not very prominently, but at least peripherally, some people who are not of clearly binary genders portrayed. And also, Lois McMaster-Bujold does a lot of talking about both the orb and generally the sort of counseling, and then that brings us back into the thing that I was talking about with people doing other kinds of sex work, like sexual surrogate work and counseling work for sexual dysfunction and other sorts of needs that are sexual but not primarily about orgasm and well, I'm going to call it transactional orgasm.
And if you're going to go into transactional orgasm and stuff like that, I think it would be really interesting for people to push more into less human sex robots. Because, you know, if you go to Babeland or somewhere like that, like enough fetishization of Southeast Asia sex bots, please. And like, it would be so much more interesting to go like Scandinavian slimline, deep sensory pressure, freaking everything. Like, I'm seeing a lot of conflation where it's like it's okay to fetishize Japanese women from Southeast Asia everywhere because Japan's really into robots. Therefore, like, and there are so many other ways of exploring sex work, and there's so many other ways of, you know, I feel like a lot of my sex toys have Scandinavian designs, you know. It's sleek, it's well formed. Like, if you're going, like, why, if you're there for the orgasm, why waste time with somebody that has an arm to get caught under them? You know, you can get deep. You could get into a pod that would be the opposite of sensory deprivation pod. It'd be fantastic. So I explore sexuality and how you would get just that transactional touch that leads to pleasant fun times. It's very limiting to get caught up in it, and I think it is one of the awful shames of my country is how much is you know, we are really close to Southeast Asia, and there are people who engage in sex tourism in Southeast Asia to the point where if you're an Australian who does a sex crime anywhere in the world, you can be charged in Australia. Doesn't matter where you did it, you did the deed, you will be fucking charged in this country or not. And that's why when Julian Assange faced charges, the first thing the Australian government did was like have a chat and go like, do you want to deal with it or will we? Like, what is going on? Because he is an Australian citizen who did the wrong thing. You know, Australia had to bring about anti-slavery legislation because of what was being done to women from Southeast Asia in Australia. So people could have charges placed against them and say that if your passport is taken away and you do not have the option to say no to a client, that is not a business relationship. That is slavery. So Australia introduced anti-slavery legislation in the 90s because of the objectification and of women, in particular from Southeast Asia. So this is like, I'm sorry to bring up such
it's important. It's really important. I'm really glad you're mentioning it.
The other thing I want to talk about is that it's, as long as we're talking about sex bots, let's actually talk about the fact that right now it is an ongoing fetish that people have, and we have real dolls going on right now and motorizing them. But
Yeah.
there's also, yes, as you said, people are actually going for the disembodied. I'm just going to get it down to the bit I'm interested in.
Give me
You
a
know,
cattle
there's-
press.
there's
You know,
an
I've
entire-
I've actually seen where
website, you
people
know,
are
sex
working on
machines.com
like
or
long
something, right?
distance devices so that you can have like Skype sex with actual working
With the
add-ons
the
with like remote controls and stuff.
it's got a name, do you know?
It's a great name.
I forgot.
Teledildonics.
Okay, say
Okay,
again,
that
Kat.
Teledildonics. We can say it together. We're clearly the sex party over here. Teledildonics.
Oh my gosh.
So tele like telephone.
And dildo in the
Yeah.
middle, and then, you know, nix because it's electronics.
I got it. I got it. It just,
Yeah.
when Che and you guys are both talking at once, I can't hear any of you. So-
I think
Sorry,
there's
what was
also
the-
like about like the sex pod. It was funny because they actually sort of do that in Barbarella. It's like that big torture device that he's playing, and she like breaks it. And then there's also like people's ability to anthropomorphize anything, like those real dolls. Like people who have them have relationships, they have names, they give them personalities. So it's humans are strange and complex things.
well, I mean, I think that goes, I mean, you can link that last piece back to the classic mythological story of the man who falls in love with the statue that he's carving, right?
Pygmalion.
Now,
Pygmalion, there we
is
go.
based.
Yes, Pygmalion, yes. And
It is
Galatea.
okay. Yeah. Yeah, Galatea.
Well, there was a wonderful. Oh, who wrote it? This wonderfully creepy short story that came out recently where she comes to life and he can't quite deal with her being animate. And she has this limited ability, but part of his love of her was her
That she
being
wasn't
still.
able
So he tries to like be grateful to the gods, but like it's weird and hard for her because she's never been a sculptor before, and he's like trying to process that, and then he starts seeing a piece of marble on the side.
Oh god.
It was in Strange Horizons or Uncanny or
That's a
something.
thing, though. That's a real thing.
Gorgeous.
Objectum sexuals who are people in love with objects. People in love
Yes.
with inanimate objects. So
There's where was I going with this? Oh, right. So we've also got the issue of slightly outside of genre. There's what's his name? Story Fermata. About it's one of those literary prize-winning sorts of stories. It's really creepy. About, you know, the delight of molesting people frozen in time. Yeah. And also, yeah, very much so. And also the movie Mannequin.
I haven't seen that.
Oh,
Oh,
you know, he's in love with
God.
mannequins,
I
blood,
saw
and it's
that
basically-
once back in the day in theaters.
yeah.
It was
So
okay.
again, but
Everybody really liked the gay guy with the glasses.
when we're having this conversation, I noticed that we're sort of conflating two things, and I feel like it's at the heart of the world building, where if you conflate sex work with like, you know, robots doing sexual things, I think it leads to validating the dehumanization of sex workers.
Yeah. I think that's actually it's not just something we're doing, but I think it's something that is commonly done all over the
I think
place.
it's cultural, yes. But it is the same thing as like sort of treating your servants like appliances.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a writer friend was talking about how much you should push back to editors and being grateful for being publishers, and said, you know, where as writers we're like prostitutes of fiction, and we should just, you know, and we can't say no. And I was like, prostitutes can say no, sex workers can say no. And
Yeah.
just like it was so casually said. It's like, you know, this is one, it's absolutely an intimate act, and there is this weird objectification. And
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the whole "I paid you, therefore you can no longer meaningfully withhold consent" trope that
all workers should be able to withhold consent.
and well, I mean, we also believe that workers in general shouldn't withhold consent as well. So it is wider than just sex work, but it becomes particularly pointed in sex work.
And almost
Capitalism.
like you should be grateful it's your job to say yes.
Yeah.
It's an entitlement that's even bigger, maybe.
Also, the terms we use, like courtesan and escort, and how when we use them as euphemisms, they blur the useful lines between people who are actually mostly there to not be receptacles for orgasms,
Yeah.
but to provide company and flavor. And oh, it's a corporate event, you must have your trophy wife, you don't have one, so she's there to be an adjunct and an accessory. But that the flavor of what happens after and around that is often assumed, I think, both by clients and by bystanders and non-participants.
Yeah.
We assume that it's all the same thing.
Well, I think there was, for example, geisha
Right.
are not about sex.
Yeah. At all.
If somebody is having sex with someone within that profession, it is a separately negotiated issue.
Right. Right.
And it's
Yeah.
that's not part of the service you're paying for.
Yeah.
And we
It's
use
more
words like
almost
hostess to do this as well.
fair, sort of, yeah, because it's like, because they are entitled to their own sort of private sex lives outside of being geisha, but even, an affair with a client is still,
Well, again, usually
like, it's
there
fine.
is actual
For,
negotiation happening and less furtive. I mean, when you say affair, it implies some kind of clandestine and
well, because
extra legal thing. And
yeah,
um,
well, I'm not sure
a
they like
lot of Western-
advertise it.
no,
Like,
what I want to talk about is the Western tendency to take away agency from people doing any of that kind of work,
Mm-hmm.
and to assume victimhood. And also, the geisha narrative is it's complicated. It's not straightforward. When we apply Western framing to it, it weirds the issue. But it is the fact that people are having emotionally or sexually intimate relations with people outside of their very narrowly defined duties as geisha,
Mm-hmm.
who are actually more cultural hostesses than anything.
Right.
I think it introduces a sordidness back in that isn't present in the way that that's conceived. And being outside of the bounds of, quote, polite society, unquote, is not the same as wretchedness. And we have a certain tendency in English to use words that apply a sort of wretchedness and sordidness and lack of agency. And it's not that there isn't strong potential for coercion involved anytime anybody is monetizing or contractualizing that interaction.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also the distinction between, and I'm going to introduce monogamy versus polyamory here. There are default mechanisms of boundaries and control, and then there are transgressive but formalized boundaries, and then there are transgressive and non-consensual or
Right.
violations not of societal norms but of selfhood. And keeping those tracks clear is really important in having honest and honorable ways of depicting this, especially for those of us who are writing this from outside that realm, because it is so easy to cause harm in the ways that people who are empowered and protected can speak about people who are marginalized or vulnerable.
Right. Well, I hate to say this, but we hit 11 o'clock.
Oh no. Of course we have.
So, as usual, we end up feeling like we're just really getting started by the time we are done. But I want to thank you all for really engaging seriously on this topic. I think it's, I think part of the reason why I was scared to bring it up and to have it on the show is because it's so easy to get it wrong. And as usual, I'm going to end with the do your research, talk to real people who know real things about this. Don't just look for it in fiction.
No.
We did children last week, Liz. And
I'm sure there's also,
and that was like full of, you know, don't go with fictional depictions of children or figure out children. But anyway, so
there's tons of nonfiction too, tons of wealth of nonfiction out there.
And I think it's also really important that when you're looking at an anthropological text or any kind of expert text, that you can't just like figure out the rules of sex work and then apply them. Even like there might be the cultural norms around how sex work is done, but there's going to be diversity. I can't be like, I've learned the rules of America. I will now write an American. There will be the America. And the American will talk to the other Americans like they're an American. You know, there's going to be arguments between powers and within powers around what is good and what is bad and what is empowered. And, oh, so-and-so told secrets out of school. You don't tell the public that kind of stuff. Oh, but I want to because this is my advocacy. Like, make sure, you know, there is no the sex work. And when you figure it out in your world building, just think of me writing The American.
Yeah, and that's actually just a good rule of thumb for everything, which is that there is no one set of rules for any social group that is larger than one person.
Yeah.
The
Cushiel series
at least 12 different
is good for like well thought out sex workers in genre.
Well, the Night Court has been very, very extensively thought through.
Yeah, and you can tell. I mean, you know, she didn't just like, oh, I'm gonna brothels. It was like, no, this is how they fit into the world, and this is how they fit into the culture, and this is how they fit into society.
Yeah.
And
in many different ways too. So so really, really have to stop. But let me tell you that our next meeting is not going to be next Wednesday. It's going to be next Monday at 10 a.m. because I have been invited to do a live session of Dive into World Building at BayCon convention. And so I know that some of you will be heading to WisCon, and so you may be busy. In fact, that might be where I met you, Liz. But
we've met a bunch of times, I'm sure.
We've crossed paths several times. But anyway, so what I want to say is I would love to have you guys there. I'm going to be doing the hangout the way that I regularly do, except that Kimberly, who's been on the show a couple of times, is going to be helping me out, and she's going to be bringing a second computer so that instead of just having, you know, my wall behind me, I will actually have another computer that has the audience, such as it is now. I'm assuming that there will be a non-zero audience, but we'll see. And I'm going to try to make sure that I can actually have people from the hangout like this and people from the audience also participate. It's going to be a little complicated, but we'll try to make it work. The theme of BayCon this year is dystopia and utopia. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and hopefully it'll be fun. It could be a little chaotic, but that's okay. And anyway, so I hope you can make it. Liz, you're welcome back anytime. Thanks for letting Liz be in the conversation there, Kat. It was very, very helpful. And so hopefully I will see you then. I don't think I have any further announcements. So why don't I stop the broadcast? Thank you all so much for being here and for your fantastic contributions.